Podcast.
And McAllister down the left field line. Connor Tate is going to round third. He will score. And rounding third is Blaylock. He will score. And the Dogs walk it off.
If you're looking for the latest Georgia Bulldog news in football, basketball, baseball, and recruiting, then you are in the right place.
It's third down, Bryce Young's career. You need 10, play clock at 4. From the pocket, launching downfield, underthrown and intercepted. Keely Ringo has an escort down the sidelines. All the way to the end zone, and Georgia is going to conquer the Crimson Tide.
Hosted by Jeremiah Stoddard and Jonathan Williams.
Georgia on the mountaintop. Demons be gone, and the drought is over. National champions at long last.
Just sit back, relax, and prepare yourself for these hot takes you're about to listen to.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Classic City Sports. As always, Jeremiah Stoddard and Jonathan Williams. Appreciate you guys being here for the first show of 2024. It's been a few weeks since we've got one in, but a lot going on with the holidays and all the change stuff. And then we realized Sunday's maybe not the best night to do it while the NFL playoffs are going on. So we figured we'd kind of shift that around a little bit in the meantime as well. So here we are live with you on a Wednesday night in 2024 to go over some stuff, a lot of stuff to cover. A lot of things have changed over the past few weeks since the last time we went live. And obviously, as you can see in the title, I put, does the SEC run through Athens now? Obviously, that is referring to the fact that Nick Saban is no longer in Alabama as the head coach. He's still there, obviously, with some stuff, but he is not the head coach at Alabama anymore. So there's a lot of stuff to discuss as far as that goes. We've had some, way too early All-American lists come out for Georgia, or in general, with a few Georgia players on there as well. And then some mock drafts and stuff coming up for the future NFL Georgia players here coming April. So, Jonathan, it's been a bit. How we feeling?
Man, I'm doing great, yeah. Definitely don't want to be competing with NFL playoffs, considering that the Chiefs game the other night got 50 million viewers. We certainly don't get 50 million viewers a week or anything like that, but don't want to be competing with that. That's the king of all sports, no doubt. So don't want to be competing with that. But certainly glad to be back. I feel like our schedule is always changing around. We kind of did an episode right after the Orange Bowl, and then we had to take a few months off. But definitely glad to be back with you doing this show. A lot of news has hit. I mean, there was the Caleb Downs thing with Georgia since the last time that we talked together. Nick Saban retired. Now Jim Harbaugh is heading to the Los Angeles Chargers. Yeah. He's no longer going to be the coach at Michigan.
That just happened an hour ago for people that are listening. If you're listening later, that happened right now.
Yeah, and it looks like Sharon Moore, the offensive coordinator, is going to be taking over as head coach there. So, I mean, college football offseason, man, sometimes you might have slow news days, and then, now it's everything just piles up. Some days it's just holy crap, everything is going. So, and I'm sure that Harbaugh is taking over at the Chargers. I'm sure that's only meaning that more people, more dominoes, and those NFL head coaching vacancies, more dominoes are going to fall in that grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I definitely think that had an impact on it. I know this is not an NFL show, but when there's an overlap to a huge college football coach that goes to the NFL, I think Jim Harbaugh was a domino that everybody was waiting to fall, right? They were trying, all these other NFL teams were trying to decide, hey, wherever he goes, that then decides what we're going to move forward with afterwards, because most of them wanted him, right? He was the big name in the coaching carousel for the NFL this year was, who can get Jim Harbaugh, and after he falls, then we're going to make our decisions on who else we're going to go with. Shoot, the Falcons, if you're a Falcons fan, they had scheduled a second interview with him today, and he canceled that interview and then accepted a job with the Chargers today. So that shows that makes an impact on the Falcons' job, makes an impact on all of them. So we'll see how the dominoes fall on all of that situation after he accepts a job. But like you're talking about with the college coaching decision now, with their offensive coordinator potentially taking over at Michigan. Like I said, in the caption here, I put in that does the SEC run through Athens now? But when in reality, when you look at the fact that Nick Saban just retired, you look at Jim Harbaugh going off to the NFL, does college football run through Athens, Georgia at this point? I think that's the question. I don't think anyone's going to sit here and argue with you and say, like, the best active head coach is Kirby Smart. And there's some people that aren't very far off from him by any means, but he is the head of the head coaches in college football now. So it begs the question, is college football just ready for Kirby Smart to take over completely and let it run through? I know it's a 12-team playoff coming up soon, but does it all run through Athens, Georgia now?
I mean, I would honestly argue that there aren't very many. I don't know if there is anybody else that's kind of close to Kirby Smart in this head coaching rankings. I mean, yesterday for our show over on the Film Guy Network, we had to list our top 10 college football head coaches, and you're like, all right, number 1, Kirby Smart, number 2. I don't know. It's kind of a toss-up at this point, especially with Harbaugh no longer there. Like, if Harbaugh was still a head coach, I would put Harbaugh at number 2 at this point. But like Dabo Swinney, he's kind of starting to trickle down that list. Maybe you put Brian Kelly, but that even feels a little gross to put Brian Kelly at number 2. I mean, I think there's a lot of really good head coaches, like guys that are right on the cusp of getting to that point, like Dan Lanning. Maybe in a couple more years, he's in that top 5 range. You could even maybe make the argument for it now. Ryan Day, say what you want about Ohio State, they've consistently been good. I mean, Kirby Smart is now the king of college football. Georgia football is the king of college football now. They've certainly become Las Vegas's darling. I mean, anytime you want to talk about odds in college football, Georgia's now at the top of those lists. They're the current national title favorites for 2024. They even did the little tease for Georgia fans during last year's playoff 2023, saying that Georgia would be favored over both Washington and Michigan. Yeah. So Vegas certainly loves Georgia. They certainly feel like they can make a lot of money off of the dogs. So I think it's hard to find anybody else to label that as. So I think absolutely it is fair to say that college football now runs through Athens and Georgia. And I mean, think about it this way. I mean, just with Nick Saban being detached from Alabama now, then the entire news cycle of college football now changes because, anytime you enter an offseason or a college football season, the narrative is, what is Alabama and Nick Saban going to do? How good are they going to be? Are they going to win another national title? Now you look up at it and it's maybe Alabama has the 6th best chance to win a national title this year. Maybe not even that. The narrative is no longer who's going to take down Alabama this season. The narrative is now who's going to go hunt after Georgia and take them down this year.
No, that's exactly how it looks now. And when you really think about like college football in general, right? Like now that Jim Harbaugh just retired, now that or not retired, but just left college football, and then Nick Saban just retired. As far as active head coaches that have national championship wins, we're talking Kirby Smart, we're talking Dabo Swinney, and Mac Brown. Is that the 3, or is there anybody
Mac
else,
Brown.
or is that it? I think that's it. I think it's Mac Brown, Dabo Swinney, and Kirby Smart. So we don't have a lot of variety in college football with proven success, And now we're going into a 12-team playoff, and that adds more games at the end of the year for you. And so it makes it a little bit more complicated, right? So like when we sit here and talk about it and say, hey, Georgia's obviously the favorite. But let me ask you this question. Georgia's the obvious favorite at this point moving forward for the foreseeable future until somebody else, puts their name up there. Obviously, Steve Sarkisian is in that conversation. We don't know what Kalen DeBoer is going to do at Alabama, and he has the roster to go with it, so we don't know what he's going to do. Mike Norvell is obviously a very good football coach. Dan Lanning, very good football coach, and has been very close at times. Ryan Day has been on the verge for several times, but he has now lost the 3 straight games to Michigan. Is it easier or harder for Georgia to go towards a national championship game in 2024 now that you have, like I just mentioned, all those teams, and all of those teams are probably going to be in the 12-team playoff format that we're going to have next year? Is it, with the 12-team format, is it harder or easier for Georgia knowing that, you got more games to play, but the odds are you don't have a lot of the big teams to play anymore? And like when the first couple rounds, you're going to be playing against lower seeds that wouldn't necessarily be on your level in a top 4 playoff situation.
I mean, honestly, I would, when I was making the argument for why Georgia can win the national title in 2024, my first point was, the one team that has stood in their way is, it's no longer that team anymore. Nick Saban is no longer there. Alabama is no longer the Alabama that we have all known for the last decade plus. So, I mean, again, that was the only current head coach that had defeated Kirby Smart since 2018. And
That's
now that
wild.
guy's no longer in the picture, I mean, that's significant for Georgia moving forward. Obviously, Texas has gotten super active in the portal, picked up some major players like Isaiah Bond and some other people over there for Sarkisian, returning Quinn Ewers. I think right now that's probably the biggest threat for this coming year, because I think you need experienced quarterback play to compete for a national title. I think that is absolutely pivotal if you're wanting to win a national title in today's era of college football. I mean, you look at all the previous national title winners, they all returned experienced quarterbacks, J.J. McCarthy being the most recent one, even Michael Penix. That dude was in 5-6 years of college football, and he made it to a national title game. So you have to have that. And so just going off of that, I think Texas and Georgia both are the top two contenders pushing for this, because I think those are two of the more complete teams in the country. But I would also say that Georgia probably has a more complete team and obviously has a better coach than, say, a Texas, because Steve Sarkisian, while he did finally make a college football playoff, I think now he's going into his 5th season, I think. Maybe I can't remember exactly, but he has two 10-win seasons now. He has 2 10-win seasons now at Texas. So I wouldn't list that as proven yet. Obviously, he finally kind of met expectations in 2023, but it's kind of the same. It's kind of, I don't want to put it at this, but I mean, it kind of feels like this type of thing of Kirby Smart being the Nick Saban now. Maybe Steve Sarkisian is going to play this Kirby Smart role of, yeah, you're doing some good things now. You're elevating that program, but it's still Kirby Smart. It's still Georgia. Georgia has been there and done that. But now with this extended playoff, nobody's been there and done that before in an expanded playoff. So it's going to be hard to tell this next season exactly who's going to stand up to the test of these more games and just how the entire format works.
Well, when we talk about like the format in general, like going from 4 to 12 is obviously going to be a huge difference. There's still a lot of question marks up in the air of how that's going to work, whether or not it's going to be, the top 5 conference champions are going to be in guaranteed, but there's not really a Power 5 anymore. And then still going to have the G5 have a representative, so like a 6 seed, in there at the 12th spot of it. So like there's so many question marks of how it's going to work out. We know there's going to be like a first round playoff, like that is going to have home field advantage for the first, I guess, 5 through 8, and then 9 through 12 is going to be on the road in that week, and then the 1 through 4 is going to have a bye week. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But when we're talking about teams that have experience in this, like Steve Sarkisian, obviously he has experience in the playoffs now. Obviously, he's been able to build up a pretty solid roster via transfer portal, recruiting, all of that kind of stuff. But Kirby's been consistent with what he has as far as a roster standpoint goes. When you're talking about, recruiting in the top 3 for the past, since 2018? Or I think it's been 2018, he has not had a class, or 17. He has not had a class that's been outside the top 3. So the entire roster's there. And when he does have a gap, he has filled those spots with the transfer portal. You look at teams that were just in the college football playoff right now, right? Then the top 4 teams. I mean, you got Michigan that just won it. Well, they're obviously losing. I know you guys talked about on your show, they had so many super seniors on their roster. Didn't they have like 12 players on their starting rotation?
Quite a few.
I think it was like 12 players that were in their 5th or 6th year of college football in that roster that were starting for them. And now they just lost Jim Harbaugh. You talk about Texas. Yeah, that's a team to watch out for. They're in the SEC next year. Obviously, they're not falling off from last year, considering everything they've got going with them with Steve Sarkisian. Alabama, just they're losing a lot of players for obvious reasons. They just completely started over their coaching staff. They don't have Nick Saban anymore. It's a huge difference right there for them. Washington, they lost Kalen DeBoer. They're losing players at the same time, and they had a bunch of success through transfer portal and everything like that, because their recruiting success was in the top 30s to 60s over the past 2 years. So they're not going to be there anymore. So there's a lot of question marks of who's going to be at that top part of college football next year. And you start looking at the 12 teams. Obviously, that includes teams like Ohio State, Oregon, and other teams like that. So there's a lot of question marks of who's going to be up there in the first place. But when we look at Alabama, let's switch the conversation over a little bit. And I know I just rambled about all that right there, but let's switch the conversation over real quick to focus on like Alabama in this conversation without Nick Saban. You and I have talked about this privately a few times. And when they went to go look for a head coach and they had that spot open, all of a sudden everybody's talking about, oh, this is the best job in college football. This is it. This is what you want. Well, was it the best job in college football because it was Nick Saban? or was it the best job in college football because of, Alabama? And the argument there, in my opinion, or the answer to that argument there is that it was the best job because it was Nick Saban. Once Nick Saban leaves, that's why you're seeing Caleb Downs, Julian Sayin, all these guys leave because they were committed to a college football coach, not necessarily the program itself. They didn't grow up loving Alabama anymore. And so when we look at the college football search that they had, when they were looking at all these different guys, and they ended up with Kalen DeBoer, which I do think that he is a good football coach, and I think that he will be able to have success in Alabama. I just don't think it's going to be what Nick Saban just had. But you got to think they were looking at Dan Lanning, Mike Norvell, potentially Dabo Sweeney, Lane Kiffin, those guys. All those guys are at programs that they've built up that they didn't feel like it was necessarily a better job for them to jump over to Alabama from those positions. What makes Alabama such a good job, and why would those guys not leave where they are at? I guess is my question. It's kind of a broad, open statement, but those guys decided that it wasn't a better job than what they currently had.
Yeah, I think what makes Alabama an appealing job is obviously proximity to talent. You're in the Southeast. You're right next to Georgia.
Very
You're
important.
near Louisiana. You're near Florida and the Panhandle. You're kind of near Tennessee, which I know they don't necessarily pump out the same amount of talent that any of those previous states that I just named are. But I mean, you're close to a lot of really, really good football players. You can even make the trip over to Texas. It's just too far, and dabble into there a little bit as well. So obviously you have proximity to talent. You're in the most pristine conference in all of college football that has the lore itself. But I mean, outside of that, there really ain't much. I mean, Tuscaloosa definitely isn't the college town that maybe you necessarily want to be at. I don't know. I've never been there. I will be making the trip this year. That's for sure.
Oh, for
But
sure.
I mean, you compare it to other places like Georgia and Athens and some other college towns around the country, certainly doesn't live up to there. But yeah, I think Nick Saban obviously made that Alabama job the job that it was, and made it so. I mean, obviously he built that program up compared to what Alabama fans were used to during the Bear Bryant days and whatnot. So it definitely took some step forwards, and it definitely made it a more appealing job once he retired. But I think, on it, and I'll die on this hill. I'll remain in this belief. If Oregon was still in the Pac-12 this next year, I think Dan Lanning takes that job. To me personally, I don't see how you would be able to stay with Oregon in the Pac-12, probably the fifth best out of the Power Five at the time, and conference-wise,
Sure. Yeah.
regarding revenue, talent pool, everything like that, TV deals and everything. I don't know why you would stay at a place in the Pac-12 when you could go down to the SEC and Alabama, who seems to be on the up and coming. So now that they're in the Big Ten, I think that definitely had a major play in Dan Lanning's decision. And I mean, honestly, now with Michigan, the way that they are, I know Ohio State's putting together a heck of a class, or has put together a heck of a class in the transfer portal. The Big Ten's wide open. It's there for Dan Lanning to take it. I mean, it's going to be Oregon and Ohio State, in my opinion, competing for that conference. Yeah. And he's going to be a playoff team in the Big Ten. And his program's going to be able to stay afloat because they are in the Big Ten in the future. So I understand why he's stayed there, but I think it also showed Alabama fans and everybody in college football, like, once your head coach decides to hang it up, I mean, Georgia fans should definitely be taking notes from this. I mean, once Kirby Smart is done, I mean, we see what's going to happen. I mean, this isn't just because it was Alabama. This is going to happen to Georgia too. I mean, it's going to happen. So enjoy it while you can, because, I mean, it was within 24 hours, that program completely changed. I mean, the entire narrative around the program, the prestige around the program, everything changed. And so it happens at the drop of a hat. And so I think, if anything, there's a lot of things you can learn from Alabama, but it's still one of the top jobs, but definitely not one of, like, I wouldn't say it's like a top 4 job.
I wouldn't say it's the top job by any means at this point, because Tuscaloosa, like you said, is like, it's not the biggest college town in the world. It's not like known for everything that's around it. Now, it is a very big job in general because of proximity to talent, like you just mentioned. I think that's a huge piece of it. I think another huge piece of it is the fact that the boosters and the culture there is, we want to win. We will put money into this program. We will make it work. And so Kalen DeBoer is going to have a lot of support to make a decent attempt at going towards making the playoffs and trying to win a national championship early in his career there. Now, I would probably say it's maybe a top 5 job. I wouldn't put it as like the number 1, but I'd probably say top 5 is a fair assessment that you could probably justify it even without Nick Saban, just because of the success they've had and the culture they've built. But when we talk about, you had made a really, really good point there, talking about like the Dan Lanning not jumping over because now they're going to the Big Ten. He's got now he's in a bigger conference. He's not in the lower level conference in college football anymore with all the changing parts. He's moved up there. I think that's a huge deal. But when we look at Kirby Smart and Georgia's ability to go towards another national title, like one of his big kryptonites has been, not being able to go up and beat Nick Saban. And Nick Saban is what Georgia's 1-5 against Nick Saban with Kirby Smart. Like I guess Kirby Smart is 1-5 against Nick Saban in the past few years here. Well, even going into this college football playoff time this year, you and I had a conversation. I thought Bama was going to beat Michigan in the first round. I was like, there's no chance that Bama loses this game. I was like, I didn't have the confidence in Michigan, but it's not that I didn't have as much confidence in Michigan as I had so much confidence in the fact that it's a Nick Saban led football team. They haven't looked great all year, but I felt like Nick Saban would be able to win that football game against Michigan. I just had so much confidence in him alone. And just knowing that he has been the reason that Georgia has lost these games against Alabama in the past several years, going back to the national championship game after the 2017 season, where they lose in overtime on the second 26 call. I look at it now without Nick Saban and say, what's Georgia's hurdle? What is Georgia's big spot that's going to be the holding up? It's not necessarily Alabama anymore, because to me, when I heard Alabama, my thought process went instantly to Nick Saban, which goes back to what I was just saying a second ago, is I thought Nick Saban would not lose that playoff game against Michigan. I thought Nick Saban would be the reason that they were able to succeed and exceed that expectation right there. But now he's gone. I don't have that thought process anymore. And I'm just a fan of Georgia football, right? I'm not a player. I'm not Kirby Smart. But obviously, Kirby Smart has had issues against Nick Saban, even though he has had the more talented roster. So now that Nick Saban is gone, the question is, what's the hurdle for Kirby Smart to keep him from being able to be the number one guy, the guy that's going to go win the next national championship over the next several years?
I'm just giggling, thinking back about poor Dan losing his bet on picking Alabama against Michigan.
Man,
RIP to our boy Dan for that one. Just put it all on Alabama, and that stuff went downhill rather quickly. But I guess the hurdle, and this might sound a little cliche because I think this is kind of what everybody wants to talk about now in college football. But I think it really is just like the schedule of college football, just the calendar year of college football, the transfer portal, the NIL deals, like all of that. I think that's I don't even know if you could call it a hurdle, because I think Kirby has done a good job of managing those things. And obviously he gets in a routine and he's figured those things out by now. I mean, we're 3 years into both of these things. So I don't necessarily call it a hurdle, but I'd say that's like the biggest challenge now. And then, of course, just adapting to what college football is now, adding in Texas and Oklahoma, no longer having divisions. So I think there's a lot of change that you're going to have to go through this next year. But I don't know if I would say that there's really a hurdle. Maybe we figure that out over the next few years. Maybe there is this new hurdle that Georgia just has to keep climbing over, but I don't necessarily see that happening. And also looks like, by the way, Georgia basketball is about to pick up a win at home against LSU, it looks like, based on the tweets that I'm getting right now. So another big win for Mike White and the boys, putting together an impressive season. So shout out to the Hoop Dogs for the season that they've had. But yeah, I just don't really see as of right now, I don't really see this hurdle that's standing in Georgia's way, other than maybe themselves. Like, if you have that one bad game like you did in December this last year, then yeah, that might be the hurdle that you have to get over. Is like, we can't keep having this one bad game, because in this college football playoff, you can't have a bad game. One bad game, that sends you home packing. You're not going to be playing for a national title. So, I guess that would be my answer.
I think that the response to that part is you actually can afford to have a bad game at this point in time. Like, you can't have it once. Yes, you can't have it once the college football playoff starts, because once you're in that, it's win or go home. But when we're even talking about like the SEC championship game next year, depending on what your seasons look like, you could afford to have a bad game in that game. I think what Georgia's biggest hurdle next year is not necessarily a specific team or a specific coach or anything like that, or the college football playoff in general. It's the fact that you got one of the hardest schedules next year in general. Like, your football schedule next year is brutal. I mean, you have to play at Texas, at Tuscaloosa, or Bama and Tuscaloosa. You have to play at Ole Miss. Those 3 games right there, you got to win 2 of them. You have to win 2 of those games, because you cannot lose you can't lose two of those games and then you get into an SEC championship game against probably one of those three teams again,
Mhm.
in that potential, or maybe you miss it out because you lost two of those games at that point when you get into that situation. And so maybe you're not playing in Atlanta and now you're a two-loss team sitting there waiting and watching to see if you can make the top 12 at that point. But if you win two of those games and then say you get to an SEC championship game with only one loss, well, then you're going to make the top 12. You're going to be a top 12 football team at that point. So you could afford to have that bad game, versus this year where Georgia was 12-0. You could not afford to have a bad game against Alabama because everyone knew if you lost that game, you weren't going to be in. We talked about it before that game happened. If you lose,
Mhm.
you are out. There is no scenario that we're going to sit here and talk about that's going to put you in. Like you need all of these dominoes to fall to let you somehow slip into the playoffs. But so you were okay with the fact that you lost that game, you weren't going to be in the playoffs because you knew how everything else was playing out. This next year, with a 12-team playoff situation, man, you can have that bad game. You could go up against Bama in that situation at 12-0 and say, well, we're in regardless. It's just determining whether or not we get that top seed and we have the first round bye, or if we have to play in that first round. Well, guess what? If we have to play in the first round, we're still going to get a home game in that first round. At that point, we'll probably drop to what, the 5 seed or something like that, and have a home game against somebody that's like a 12 seed, which I'm a Liberty fan. Don't get me wrong. That's my alma mater. But if Georgia plays Liberty next year as a a 2-loss team or a 1-loss team at the 5 seed, man, it's gonna be, you're automatically in the next round anyways. Like I think that the window is so wide open for Georgia moving forward with all the scenarios playing out the way they are. The biggest hurdle is just your regular season next year because you have one of the hardest regular seasons that you have had at Georgia in so long, so long.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that's why the news of Carson Beck returning was such a big deal because, I mean,
Massive.
from week one, I mean, it is a gauntlet of a schedule. Now, Georgia is going to beat the absolute crap out of Clemson. I don't know if Clemson fans are aware of that. I don't know if anybody else is
Yeah,
aware of that. I think Georgia's
bloodbath.
already listed as a 12.5 point favorite in January for that
That's
week
a
one game.
3
But
touchdown game, by the way.
it,
3
it's
touchdowns.
there's going to be a dead body left on Mercedes-Benz field. I'll tell you that much. It's going to be a slaughter. Anyways, I think having Carson Beck going through those road games, because I mean, you nailed it. I mean, your three of your road games are your 3 biggest games of the entire season. You got to go through Oxford, you got to go through Austin, Texas, and you got to go through Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I mean, obviously that Alabama game may not end up being as big of a game as we thought it would be, but it's still Georgia,
It's still
Alabama.
a big game, man. It's
Oh
you
no,
don't
absolutely,
until you know
still a
what
big game.
Alabama's going to look like next year. Like they still have so much of their talent. They've lost what, like 22 players overall, but most of those guys were gone before Nick Saban was gone, anyways. And so you're only like the big names, obviously going, like Proctor's leaving, Julian Saint's gone, Caleb Downs is gone, but they were going to. They were going to experience attrition anyways. They were going to lose guys anyways, but there's a few big names they lost in there. They're still Alabama next year. They still got the roster. Like if you were to look at the roster composite for next year, I'm sure they're still in the top 3 of that, regardless of the players they just lost this year. So next year, going to Alabama against that roster with Kalen DeBoer, that's still a big game. It's gonna be a big game for you. Now, you
Yeah,
can't
it's
go
still.
in there expecting it not to be a big game.
I'm not. I know. And I wasn't trying to say that it wasn't going to
No,
be a
I
big
know,
game
I know.
anymore. Obviously, going to Bryant Denny Stadium, that alone in itself, Georgia, Alabama, that is going to be classified and labeled as a big game for the next 20 years. I don't care who the head coach is at Alabama. Those two teams playing, everybody's
Yeah,
going to be watching that one. But I do think that Georgia, Texas now, I mean, you can even make the case that that's the biggest football game of the entire college football season. I mean,
it
that's
is.
the top 2
That is.
dogs according to the national title odds. I mean, that is going to have college football playoff implications on it, SEC championship game implications labeled on it. I mean, it is going to be an absolute madhouse in Austin that week. So, absolute massive game. It's going to be a fun season regardless. So, looking forward to it. We'll be talking about that game and the other 2 games and the rest of the schedule from now until August. So,
I'm gonna have to put some money aside for my travel budget for next year because those 3 games right there, I promise you, I'm gonna
Hey,
be at all
this
three of
is a
them.
season to let it flow. This is a
I'm
season
gonna
to
be
just
at all
empty
three
out
of
the
those
pocket.
games for sure. Like, there's no chance I'm not at all 3 of those games next year.
I know
Like,
it's like you talk about those games. You're like, well, I definitely got to go to Austin, right? Like, I definitely got to go to
yeah,
Georgia, Texas, right? And I really need to go experience Oxford and the Grove and Ole Miss
that
and all
one's a
that.
must for me. I think
Yeah,
the
like
2
that.
bigger games, like if I were to miss one of those games, the game that I'm probably like I would not go to over the other 2 would be Alabama. I would
Mhm.
miss Tuscaloosa before I
Yeah,
miss going to Austin,
yeah,
Texas, or I miss going to Oxford, Mississippi, because I've been waiting for Oxford for so long. The last time Georgia played there was like 2015, and obviously I was
16.
much. Was it 16?
Yeah,
I was much younger at that point, and so that's 10, 8 years ago, whatever it is. Like, I wasn't necessarily traveling for football games as much back then. So I've been looking forward to going and experiencing. It's talked about as being one of the better college football atmospheres, I think, in general. And Austin, Texas, you and I got to go there last year, about a year ago in January, and kind of be down there for that and experience the town and all that. I can only imagine what that is during college football as well, and during the season. Like, it's going to be electric. The game day environment is going to be so crazy. Tuscaloosa, especially now that Nick Saban's not there, if I had to pick one of the 3, that's the game that I wouldn't go to
Mhm.
because of the other 2 being so big. But I'm going to be at all 3 of those. I can tell you right now.
Yeah, I'm planning on it as well. I already pretty much got everything worked out to be in Texas. Whether or not I have credentials for that game, no idea. But I will be in Austin,
If you don't
Texas
have
for that game. I
credentials,
can
it's going
tell
to
you.
be you and me just rocking it. We're going to be
Well, hey,
good.
we'll find a place to
We'll be
squat.
there.
We'll catch the
Yeah,
game either
we'll be
way.
there. Yeah, for sure.
All right, we can kind of shift the conversation now. We mentioned mock drafts. It is getting into that year. You enter the off season, the NFL draft coming up in April. NFL Combine will be shortly before that. And so obviously Georgia, I think, had 10 players declare for the NFL draft this year. And obviously still got some first round prospects on the board for this next season. And so Mel Kiper went ahead and released his first, I think it's his first edition, maybe even his second edition of his first round mock
Yeah.
draft. And so we can go ahead and kind of talk about that. Surprising or not, it was surprising to me. He had Brock Bowers going number 5 to the Los Angeles Chargers. He had Kamari Lassiter going 20th overall to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then he had Amarius Mims going 32nd overall to the San Francisco 49ers. So I guess congratulations to San Francisco for your Super Bowl win. But yeah, they snagged Amarius Mims right there
Yeah.
at the bottom of the first round. Any thoughts on those 3 guys being in the first round? Any guys that you think maybe they missed over or what?
No, I definitely don't think there's a miss on those 3 guys being first round talents. I think the biggest thing is Brock Bowers is obviously. We've been talking about him being a potentially a top 5 pick for a year now, because we know where Kyle Pitts went, and we know he went number 4 overall to the Falcons,
Yep.
and hasn't quite lived up to the hype on there. And so the question has been whether or not that would impede Bowers' ability to go that high, or if Bowers was just different now that he had 3 straight years of college football being as good as he was, not necessarily just like one really, really big year that Kyle Pitts had at Florida before he went that high. I think that's a very good spot for him, right around the top 5 mark,
Yep.
just top 10 in general. If maybe not top 5, if he were to fall a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised. But I would be surprised if he wasn't in the top 10 picks for the NFL draft this year. Kamari, I think he is, probably one of the better cover corners that Georgia's had in a
Mhm.
very long time. So I think the NFL is going to love him. I think he'll do well at the combine. I'm not thinking he's going to necessarily just destroy the combine, but I think he will do well and solidify himself in that top, top first round in general. The one that surprises me is Amarius Mims being 32nd. Are we really saying that Amarius Mims is going to fall that late in the first round? I think he's a
Oh,
first
here's the
rounder.
best part, Stoddard. He was the ninth offensive tackle taken off the board in Mel Kiper's mock draft. Ninth, the
And
ninth
he's so
offensive tackle.
ninth puts him at 32 overall.
Yep.
No chance. No chance that he falls out of like I'd say he's probably what top 4. Like I know there's some good
Yeah.
tackles out there, but if he's not top 4, I'd be surprised as far as offensive tackles go. Not saying he's top 4 overall, but as far as offensive tackle goes,
Oh
I
yeah.
guess maybe one of the big holdups with him is his playing time. A lot of people talk about like starting quarterbacks in the NFL, only having 1 year of college experience and everything, going back to Mac Jones getting 1 year starting at Alabama, and then is a big draft pick, and hasn't quite lived up to the hype. Are they looking at that when they look at Amarius Mims as well? Because he's only started 9 games, 10 games, something
8
like
games, I
that total,
think.
8 games. So
I
he's only
think.
started 8 games. So maybe that's the hesitation on him. But he's going to destroy the combine.
Oh yeah,
He
that's what I was
is.
about to say. This is what's going to happen. So they're going to talk about Amarius Mims only starting 8 games or whatever for his college career and be like, huh, a little interesting. But nonetheless, they're going to see him walk out in his tank top and spandex, and they're going to go, Amarius Mims measured in at what? You said 6'8", 6'9"? Okay. And he weighed in at 330 pounds. Okay. And he ran a sub 5 in the 40-yard dash. Okay. Yeah. So put that guy at the top of our NFL draft board. That's exactly how it's going to go. I mean, that guy is going to have everybody's jaw dropping on the NFL Combine. That dude is as freaky as it gets from an offensive lineman prospect. He's definitely not the 9th best offensive line prospect. He's certainly top 5, probably top 3 in my opinion. So I don't even see 9 offensive tackles getting taken in the first round. So I thought that alone was a stretch, but I don't see
That would
Amarius
be a
Mims.
huge number. That's
Yeah.
what surprised me when you said that. You said 32 overall. I wasn't necessarily thinking he was that far down the list on it. But are we really saying that there's going to be 9 not even offensive linemen? You said offensive tackles taken.
Offensive tackles.
So we think 9 offensive tackles are going to be taken in the first round of the draft to put him at 32, and I think that's a crazy statement to think is going to actually happen. And I think what people have to realize is, he was behind Warren McClendon, at tackle for a couple of years, and he was going to go somewhere else, so he could have started an extra year. And Georgia convinced him to come back for that extra year at Georgia. And when he came back, he still had to sit there and wait. He came back and he was on the bench for that next year. He didn't even come back and start when they got him coming. They convinced him to come back and sit on the bench instead of going to a Florida State, last year or 2 years ago when he was in that transfer portal. And so he came back,
Ended
and so
up getting
he
him
only
in trouble.
Florida State's in trouble for that whole recruitment right now of Amarius Mims. They lost 5 scholarships for the 2 years, or
5
something like that?
scholarships, and for this spring transfer portal window, they can't contact anybody for a whole week.
Yeah. So that's because of Amarius Mims.
It is.
And the fact that Georgia still continued to get him to stay at Georgia afterwards, after getting another team in trouble for recruiting transfer portal violations. But you talk about him staying and deciding he wanted to be at Georgia, even though he was going to sit an extra year and not get those games. I think that's what NFL teams are going to have to look at in this day and age. That's a pretty big deal that he decided he wanted to stay at Georgia, and then his last year at Georgia, and he got to start, and he obviously had I think it was an ankle injury, wasn't it? Didn't he have tightrope issues and stuff like that?
Yeah.
So he only ended up starting about 8 games. I think that should still tell you he was as good as he was in that short period of time. But when you're talking about a tackle, it's not like talking about a quarterback, right? Quarterbacks being able to just have a one hit, wonder kind of thing is very different than talking about an offensive tackle. Offensive tackle is a very, very big physical ability position. You either can do it or you can't. You're not going to come out there and be an offensive tackle for a year, a left tackle especially, and be really good and then not be good after that. You're either good or you're not when it comes to that position. It's not like being a starter at quarterback that you don't necessarily know if they can continue that next year. It's very different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's become a measurables game, and he checks every single box when it comes to measurables. So he'll do fantastic in that grand scheme of things. I did think it was interesting that that Kuiper had Kamari going to the Pittsburgh Steelers, not at the placement of the pick, not because it was a top 20 pick or anything like that. I think he's absolutely worthy of that. I think he is one of the top corners
For sure
in the draft. But I think it's interesting they picked Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh last year picked Joey Porter, another defensive back who was absolutely phenomenal this last season for the Steelers. I think it's interesting that they would go that route, go another defensive back. I think Kamari Lassiter and Joey Porter would be a phenomenal pairing for the Steelers on defense. But I think that Kamari would likely go somewhere else. I think Kamari has an opportunity to be the best pro out of this entire group, including Brock Bowers, or outside of Brock Bowers. Well, I mean, it's an easy take to say Brock Bowers is going to have the best professional career because it's freaking Brock Bowers. You could see that after the Clemson game in 2021. But I think Kamari Lassiter, being as technically sound as he is, as much as he loves football, as much as he loves this sport and the position that he plays, like you always need good defensive backs in the NFL. And really, it only takes one good season for you to lock yourself down for a roster spot for at least the next 5 years. I mean, we've seen defensive backs over the last few years, like Josh Norman, Richard Sherman at the end of his career probably didn't belong on the football field.
Stephon Gilmore is another one.
Gilmore. I mean, several examples of these guys where you put together at least 1 or 2 really, really good seasons, you're going to continue finding yourself on NFL rosters, and you're going to find yourself playing on NFL rosters. So I think Kamari Lassiter has a great opportunity to have a long, successful NFL career.
I think that's very accurate as well. When we look at that, and I know you kind of posed the question a second ago, I'll ask you, kind of return it back to you in a second. But those 3 are obvious, first round talents. Is there somebody else that you think is borderline or on the verge of being a first round talent, or should be in not just borderline, but should be listed as a first round talent for Georgia?
Honestly,
It's kind of hard to say, right? It is hard
honestly,
to
I
say.
think I'd have to go with no. I just
Yeah.
don't see anybody else being a first round count. I mean, like, I just knowing that, like, Javon Bullard, obviously that's the first name I think everybody would come to mind as maybe the next
I just
person that
don't
could
think
get
he's a
themselves in
first
that mix.
rounder.
I just don't think he's going to measure out and test as
Yeah,
well
he
as
doesn't have the
everybody else.
size.
I think Roots is saying SVP. SVP plays like a first round talent. SVP is talented enough to be a first rounder, but because he plays center and because he's probably not going to test exactly as well as all these other offensive linemen in the draft, I don't see him going in the first round for those. I mean, you really don't ever see centers go in the first round, but I think if you ever were going to draft a center in the first round, Cedric Van Pram would be a great option for you in the first round. I just don't see him landing in that range. It's kind of the same thing for Javon Bullard. Like, he's not going to measure out well. I mean, he's shorter than what you probably want and as a safety in the NFL. But dadgum, is that kid freaking good? The tape is elite. He loves football. He plays he plays his position exceptionally well. He can play nickelback. He can also play safety for, like, that guy has immense talent, and he's going to do great in the NFL. But there's just, we know how the NFL draft goes. We know what is set at the top of the list when it comes to these NFL draft picks, especially in the first round. And, some guys, as talented as they are, as successful as they were in college, we just know that, like, it's just not going to happen because these NFL organizations and these GMs, they favor some things over others, and some guys just don't have those things that they favor.
So you're right. I think SVP is the borderline player. I think he's more borderline first round than I would say Bullard is, just because I think that the measurables and everything like that for Bullard are going to be what keeps him. Definitely. In my head, I would be so shocked if he were first round. Not because I don't think he's talented, but because I don't think that the NFL is going to measure him out the way that he needs to be. Because they are extremely big on that. That's why we see certain quarterbacks get drafted so high that they do, just because they're 6'4", 220 and stuff like that, and they've got the big arm. And they may not have had the great college career, but they measure out like that, so they go high. When you look at a guy that maybe did have a great college career and doesn't measure out, they usually fall down the list when we're talking about them. So I would be extremely shocked if I saw Bullard go first round, versus where I wouldn't be very shocked if I saw SVP go first round. I think he could theoretically make the argument for, being measurably there and having obviously the game tape, the film, to show that he's been able to perform at that level. But when I look at, like, I want to talk about Bullard for a second, and I would say his player comp for me, in the way that he's in the offensive or the defensive style that he's played. And yeah, he's technically a safety, but he's played at that star position for Georgia. He reminds me a lot of, like, the style that Jamal Adams played in the NFL when he was with the Seahawks. And yeah, he's a safety, but he didn't really play a true safety position. He played kind of a sub linebacker, almost a nickel. The NFL didn't necessarily have that star position when he was playing. It was kind of a sub linebacker or just playing nickel in general. But he was so big in run support, and he would blitz, he would make those plays in that side, he would make those plays at the line of scrimmage and a lot, and then cover those over the middle routes and make those big hits. That's what Bullard reminds me of. He reminds me of a Jamal Adams when he played for the Seahawks, and I think he could have a great career. He just necessarily isn't going to be a first round draft pick because of his measurables. I think that's going to be what holds him back. But I don't think he's going to be held back once he actually gets in the NFL and a team gets to look at him and say, man, we're just going to let you do what you do, and you're going to do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you there on the Bullard front, and I'll kind of wind back over to SVP, and this will be the last thing that I say about this. But the best thing that Cedric Van Pran is going to do better than probably anybody else in this entire draft class is he's going to interview better than anybody else. He's going to sit down in a chair across some members of an NFL organization, and they're going to sit there and ask him questions. And they're going to walk out of that interview thinking like, that is the best human being and football player that I have ever met in my entire life. I have had very limited interactions with Cedric Van Pran, so I can't really speak for myself. But I've heard Brooks mention this multiple times. And I mean, every single time that he goes into an interview with Cedric or he interacts with Cedric or anything like that, he says you just become a smarter person when you talk to someone like Cedric. That guy knows football. He's extremely intelligent. Everything about him just screams that he's a great person. And he also is a great leader on and off the football field. So I think it's also important that he goes to the correct NFL organization. He can't be going somewhere like, I don't know, the Arizona Cardinals right now, who's going to lose a bunch of games. Like that ain't the type of place for him. But if the right NFL organization does want to take a first-round pick on him, if they see that he's going to interview so well that maybe that's what launches him into that first round.
Yeah, he is going to interview very well. I mean, you talk about Brooks's interactions with him. Obviously, I've never had any personal interaction with him either, but I've watched the interviews of him and like the way he talks. Like I can understand what Brooks is saying when he talks about how smart he is and how good he does at it. And like you learn when you sit there and talk to him. 'Cause, I mean, you see it in his face. And we're talking about a guy like when we're talking about offensive line. Longevity is a hard thing to have, right? Like you see these specific
Yeah,
offensive linemen have really long careers and they could play into their 30s. They can play until they're 35 sometimes, but there's only a few of them that can actually do that. And you look at SVP, and he started 44 consecutive games at Georgia.
44
I
consecutive
think it was
games.
44. That tells you the dude just doesn't. If he can play, he's gonna play. He's not gonna sit out for
Yeah,
anything.
no kidding.
Like he's not going to sit out unless you tell him he has to sit out. He's going to play through it. He was hurt at times during his career at Georgia. He was banged. I won't say hurt. I won't say injured. I'll say he was dinged up. He guaranteed
Sure.
dinged up. You play football, you're dinged up. But to not miss a game and play 44 straight games at Georgia, that's impressive. That tells you he's that type of guy. And yeah, the interview process for him is going to be what skyrockets him on the boards in general. But kind of like what Rudes is talking about for SVP is he's not as sexy as an offensive tackle is in that
Yeah.
first round. I think in the first round when you see offensive linemen go, it really is offensive tackles, and that's why you see Amarius Mims potentially going at ninth, the ninth offensive tackle and still being a first rounders because they're going to go offensive tackle. If they're going in the first round, offensive line, they're going tackle.
Yeah, more
Center
times
is
than
not
not.
a position you see them go, first round all the time. It's just one of those things that you just don't see. When you look at,
Mhm.
certain positions in the NFL in general, running back is one that you see a few of them, obviously, over the past couple of years with, Branson Robinson, or not Branson Robinson, Bijan Robinson going in the top 10. You
Jahmyr
don't see
Gibbs.
running backs go that early that often anymore. You see like Nick Chubb fell to the late first round. You see guys like
Like
that go.
second round or early second round.
Did he go like 33? He was like the first or
Sony
second pick of
Michelle
the.
Sony Michelle was the late first
That's
round
right.
pick, and then I think Chubb was like the first
Chubb was
second round pick.
He was either the first or second. He was like right there at the beginning of the second round. I remember that. I mixed those two up. I knew it was one or the other. But
Yeah.
point being, and look at what Chubb is doing in the NFL. He's a very, very good running back in the NFL. He's one of the best in the NFL. But the position itself isn't recruited as high in the NFL to go in the first round. You do see the generational type talent guys like Bijan Robinson get to go that high. Um, but you don't necessarily see it all the time. So, and I love SVP a lot, but I don't know if he's looked at as a generational talent at center. He's a very good center, and he could play for 12 years in the NFL once he gets where he's going. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a generational talent at it, where they're going to want to spend a first round pick on him when you have so many other needs on your team. I think that's just one of those downfalls of the position you play. You're a very good football player, but the position you play isn't necessarily valued as high as other positions are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's just how the NFL goes. I mean, Cedric Van Pran is going to end up playing in the NFL for a very, very long time. I mean, and we've seen this from other Georgia centers. Ben Jones and David Andrews have been great examples of this, where once you find yourself a spot and people know that you're a dude, I mean, you're going to continue to hold a roster spot in the NFL. So absolutely, doesn't matter what round or what team, or it doesn't matter what team, but it doesn't matter what round he goes to. he's going to be in the league for a very, very long time. But that is all I have for today, unless you want to add anything else, Stoddard.
Did you want to talk about the All-American, the early All-American thing real quick,
Oh,
or
we can hit on those real quick.
let's hit
Yeah,
on it real quick?
Um, I can pull
You
this.
got it pulled
This
up.
comes from ESPN as well. This is predicting who the 2024 All Americans are going to be, both on offense and defense. There were 3 of them from Georgia, 2 of them on offense, and 1 of them on defense. Probably none of them being any surprises. Carson Beck, first team All American quarterback. Tate Ratledge as an All-American for the offensive line, and then on defense, to no surprise, Malachi Starks at safety. I will say this is what is interesting to me. I was reading up on a list that was talking about this. Also came from ESPN, so just giving them all kinds of love and shout outs today. But it was talking about the top prospects for the 2025 NFL draft class. And when it came to interior offensive linemen, they had Dylan Fairchild listed, and then they had Tate Ratledge listed as a sleeper for that draft class. And of course, Carson Beck was in there. Trevor Etienne was in the running back list. Malachi Starks in at safety, and Nazir Stackhouse was in the defensive tackle position. They actually, I think it was Matt Miller who wrote this article. He said that a lot of people were surprised that he decided to come back this next season, because prior to the 2023 season, a lot of them had him tabbed as a top 50 player for this year's draft class. They were pretty shocked that Stackhouse decided to return. So that should kind of tell you what level of a player Georgia is going to be getting on the defensive line this next year.
Look, I love Nazir Stackhouse, but I that surprises me that they had him tabbed as a top 50 player. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
And this was
that's a
last year before he
high.
was like a full-time starter.
Yeah, that surprises me. I didn't know that. And that, I mean, I think he's a great football player. I think Georgia's defensive line next year, kind of segueing off the conversation a little bit, I guess, but I think Georgia's defensive line next year has a chance to be a lot better than it was this year with Stackhouse, and then you got McLeod coming in next year as well, and then keeping. Gosh, I'm going to blank on a name right now, and it's the one that I know.
Warren Brinson.
Warren Brinson, thank you. And I think he's the most disruptive of them all. And I forgot his name for a second there, but I think Georgia's defensive line is going to be a lot better. But yeah, going back to that list, it doesn't surprise me to see Carson Beck on that. It doesn't surprise me to see Tate Ratledge on there. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts on that Georgia's offensive line next year with people leaving for the NFL. So you don't necessarily see as many on that list. But and defensively, Malachi Starks is. You and I were sitting there talking about it, and I know everybody was, not just the two of us, but everybody was talking about, what that defensive back room could have looked like if Georgia got Caleb Downs to play alongside Malachi Starks. Would have been stupid good. I mean, stupid good.
I hate
But
that we
you
got
still
Rocky
have,
back.
even not getting him, you wanted him, you didn't have to have him, so you feel okay that you don't have him kind of thing. It's not like it ruins your week or anything like that, but you would have loved to have him. It would have made your week if you did get him. But you still have Malachi Starks playing back there, and his capabilities and what he's going to do for you on that side as well, along with getting KJ Bolden this year, along with the other guys that are in that safety and defensive back room this year. I think Georgia's going to be in great hands moving forward. But yeah, I think that's all I got for tonight. I don't know about you.
Last thing I'll say is it looks like Georgia might end up having the number 1 overall pick next year. There's a lot of people showing a lot of love and belief in what Carson Beck is about to do in year 2.
Yeah.
And if he plays anywhere close to, or if he plays up to what he did last year, or he even exceeds what he did last year, I think you can pretty much pencil that dude in as probably the number 1 overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft class. But we appreciate all of you guys for joining us in tonight. I know we usually go on Sundays. We went to Wednesdays this week. Even switched up the time a little bit for you. Went 15 minutes later than we normally do. But we appreciate all of you guys for tuning in, joining in on the conversation. Everybody, every single one of you that popped in the comment section, at least mentioned something. We appreciate you guys for continuing to show love to us. Hopefully, we'll be a little more consistent for you moving down the rest of the offseason. But if you want to keep updated with us and our hectic schedules, we will always keep you updated over on Twitter when we are going to go live and anything else that we feel is worthy of noting to you guys. So follow us on social media if you haven't already. Like and subscribe. We're so close to getting to 500 subscribers. You guys killed it last time we did an episode. So continue to do that. Continue to support us. And Stoddard, you can close us out.
Yeah, you guys have been extremely supportive of us, even though it's been towards the off season. And we know we haven't done an episode in a couple weeks, but with all the holiday stuff going on, and then the NFL playoffs going on, and then this past week we were going to do an episode, but I had to have wisdom teeth taken out, so I wasn't quite capable of doing an episode. Just now getting back to where I can eat some solid foods a week later, so struggling to get through it. But we appreciate you guys supporting us. and keeping up with us. Like you said, make sure you like and subscribe and keep up with us on social media so you can keep up with our schedule as it's changing. But hopefully moving forward, Wednesday nights are kind of what we're tabbing in for the foreseeable future, with the playoffs and everything being on the weekends right now. When maybe we move it around again in a month or so. But as of right now, our plans are to keep the schedule Wednesday nights around 8 o'clock. We appreciate all of you. And as always, keep it classy in the Classic City. We will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Classic City Sports. Take a second to subscribe, rate, review, and share with your friends and family. Feel free to reach out to the Classic City Sports crew on Twitter with any topics you'd like discussed. You can reach out to Jeremiah at The Stodfather, to Jonathan at Dr._J Will, and make sure to follow at Classic City Pod for show updates. Check back next week for a brand new episode. In the meantime,